obviously if you're going there to live. Just a brief understanding, I suppose, as to why the UK is such a popular market to buy property within. Certainly from here in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is the second largest investor into the UK property market behind the British people. It's an open market, so you can buy any type of property anywhere you want and as many as you want. So Li Ka-shing buying up £30 billion worth of London or Manchester is because he finds it easier doing business. He's not restricted by the number of properties he can buy or what type of property he can buy. And that's obviously the same for us mere mortals who perhaps don't have £30 billion, but it means that the market's open. So if you take Australia as an example, you have to be FIRB regulated or accredited, so you can only buy a brand new property, you can't buy a second-hand property. None of those restrictions exist in the UK. It's transparent, it's got one of the oldest mature legal systems in the UK. For us here in Hong Kong, it's also relatively easy to understand because our laws are very similar, certainly in terms of process of buying and taxes involved around that. The UK market's stable. We are generally a country of homeowners. It's something that we're passionate about, as I know we are here in Hong Kong, and we've got data stretching back to the last century in terms of the UK property market. So it gives you an opportunity to do a significant amount of due diligence and understand areas, what's upcoming. You can see property cycles and things like that. It's secure. Laws are very much weighted towards homeowners and people who own homes. So even if you're investing into the UK property market, the laws are very much weighted towards the landlord rather than the tenant. So if you think about some country like Germany, where the majority of the population will rent their property, then as you would expect, the laws of that country are weighted more towards the tenant to protect the wider population, if you like. Whereas in the UK, most people are homeowners, so the laws are more weighted towards the owner rather than the tenant. Just a very brief understanding of buying property in the UK, the people who are involved in that, very, very similar, as I say, to Hong Kong. There's two solicitors who are involved. One is the seller's solicitor. They are absolutely independent of the buyer, and they are wholly appointed to protect the interests of the seller. And obviously, conversely to that, you've got the buyer's solicitor. So that's you or me buying that property. So we have a completely independent solicitor who is wholly aligned to us as the buyer and is there independent of the seller or the developer to protect my interests or our interests. Those two solicitors, the contract will always be made up by the vendor's solicitor. That will be passed over to the buyer solicitor. They will review that and present reports to you to just give you a good understanding of what that contract entails and what that means for you and what effect that has on you. The buying process for the UK, you obviously need to look for a house, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation as to what to look for. But you find a house that you'd like to buy, you would then appoint your solicitor. Your solicitor would be in contact with the seller's solicitor. As with everything at the moment, anti-money laundering obviously is incredibly important, so you'd be expected to present your proof of identity and proof of address, usual sort of thing that pretty much happens in most transactions these days, but anti-money laundering checks. Your buyer solicitor will then receive the documents from the vendor's solicitor, and they will go through that contract with a fine-tooth comb. So they will ensure that there's nothing that is too more favourable to the seller rather than you, because they're there to protect your rights. That doesn't mean that everything in that contract will be weighted more towards the seller. What they will do is negotiate a position where they feel that it's fair. If they get to a position where they feel that there's a slight favourable clause to the vendor, then they may accept that, but they will certainly communicate that with you, and then the decision is yours as to whether you accept that. At the point where everybody's happy, you've reviewed all the documents, then that's at the time, obviously, the contracts will be signed. The funds will be sent from the buyer to the buyer's solicitor, and at that point, the two solicitors will call each other. It's called exchange of contracts. It's not a physical exchange of contracts. It just means that the vendor solicitor has all his contracts and paperwork signed, and your buyer solicitors has yours, and then on the phone they'll agree that they have those documents and the funds, and then they'll exchange those contracts. At which point you then become the owner of that property. Buying property in the UK, for mere mortals, those of us who aren't Lee Carshing and can perhaps pay in cash, the mortgages available in the UK, rates are higher than they are here, certainly in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has some excellent lending rates. In the UK, the mortgage rate is based on the Bank of England base rate, or LIBOR. Here in Hong Kong we have HIBOR, obviously. But at the moment in the UK it's 0.75%, which is obviously incredibly low. And then on top of that, the bank will put on their typical cost of lending. So that could be anything from 2.5% to 4%, and maybe even lower. But at the moment, typically you're looking at interest rates of around 3.25 to 4% all in. In respect of term, so how long can you have the mortgage loan for? In the UK, they will take you up to the age of 65, okay? But the maximum term you'll ever get is 30 years, but it's usually 25. That's typical. So if I give you an example, just so you understand that clearly, say I'm 45 years old, then the bank would give me a 20-year mortgage, okay? Loan to value. So at the moment, we've gone beyond 2008 and all the subprime mortgages and lending 110% and things like that. And in the UK now, generally the highest loan to value you can get is 75%. So they'll lend you, the bank will lend you 75% of the value of the property. I won't touch on this too much because obviously Howard's already done this and he's the tax expert, but same as Hong Kong, there's stamp duty in the UK, yeah, I won't go into that too much. It's a sliding scale based on the value of the property. The other thing to consider, certainly if you're investing, not so much if it's your own home, because if it's your own home, then you don't pay capital gains tax on your own main property. But there is capital gains tax in the UK, which is different to here in Hong Kong. Again, I won't go into too much detail. It's based on the profit anyway, and the tax rate's at 18% or 28%, depending on the income that you've made during that time. During that year, rather, that financial year that you're disposing of that asset. You also get a nil rate band, which I think at the moment is about £12,500, I think, Howard. So the first £12,500 of your profit you don't pay any capital gains tax on. This is probably a bit more exciting for you rather than talking about tax and mortgages, etc. But really, what I wanted to put together was just a little bit of an understanding of what to look for. So obviously many people who are emigrating over into the UK, many people will be taking family with them and children, and obviously with that then education is a very serious consideration, as it is for me with my children, etc. So what to do, what to look for, why you know, what's important about where you live in respect of education in the UK. Well, there's a number of things and a number of tools that you can use. So firstly, you know, you want your children to go to a good school. So in the UK there's an organisation called Ofsted, a government organisation. And what they do is regularly go around the schools and they will rate them. So they do a full report and then they rate those schools. So it can go from poor to needs improvement to fair to good to excellent. And that then, so I've got an example here of Manchester, which is my home city, in an area where I do have a property. The postcode is M15. So you can go onto the Ofsted website. So if you're moving to London, or you're moving to Manchester or Liverpool or Birmingham, if you know the sort of areas where you want to live, or you know the city, then obviously you can just use that to search which schools are very good in that area. The reason that it's important to live near those schools is certainly if your children are going to go to a state school, and a good state school, then there's something called a catchment area. So that's generally a ring that's drawn, an imaginary ring around the centre of where that school is, and there'll be a number of postcodes. So children who live within that postcode will be in the catchment area of that school, if that makes sense. So if you're within that M15 postcode that I've got here, then there'll be a list of schools that my property falls within that catchment area, so my children will be able to apply to go to that state school. So that's obviously very important. Local knowledge, and something that of course we'd be delighted to help you with, having been on the ground in the UK for so long, and having our own office in the UK. And if you ever go to the UK for a visit, then you're more than welcome to speak to our colleagues in the UK, and I'm sure they'll be happy to show you around the cities and give you their knowledge of those cities in the UK, and places to live, and schools and education, etc. But obviously local knowledge is incredibly important. My sitting in Manchester 15 years ago, before I came to Hong Kong, if somebody came to me and said, I'd like you to come to Hong Kong, I'd like to come and live in Hong Kong, where do you want to live? Well, I wouldn't really want to speak to somebody from Hong Kong to tell me what's the areas, where would I fit in best, where's the schools, what's the amenities. So local knowledge is incredibly important. So, as I say, with our office here in Hong Kong, please do come and see us in Central. If you're going over to the UK, and my colleagues in the UK will be happy to take you around the sittings there as well. Can't really talk about the UK without talking about Brexit. I'm going to talk about Brexit just from a property perspective. We've called it the low impact referendum, which is probably slightly flippant, because obviously there will be an impact on the UK depending on what the outcome of Brexit is. But certainly in terms of property, the UK hasn't been significantly hampered detrimentally by the property prices drop since Brexit, and it seemed to go on unabated. And the reason behind that is that there's a significant supply and demand issue with property in the UK. You're getting a lot more single occupied home ownership, and the population is growing far faster than we can build properties. Interest rates have been low, which has made it easier for people to get mortgages, so more and more people are looking to buy into the UK market. There's been some big developments from the government, like Help to Buy, to get first-time buyers onto the market, so that's stimulated the UK market. So certainly there's the major cities in the UK are seeing some significant increases due to things like that in terms of interest rates and government initiatives. Talked about supply and demand. There's a shortage of about 100,000 houses every year in the UK. Every budget, the government are talking about how they're going to address that, because it's potential to damage the economy. The last budget, they talked about 300,000 homes being built between in the sort of commuter belts from Milton Keynes all the way through Cambridge and Oxford. Immigration. Obviously, one of the disturbing things, I suppose, was that Brexit was one of the biggest battles of Brexit was about immigration. And coming from the UK, I understanding how that was. It certainly is something that has been quite divisive. Having said that, certainly when I look at my home city, Manchester, the other big cities, Birmingham, Liverpool, and London, is they have huge Asian communities. So London is the first largest in terms of their Chinatown and China population. Manchester second, Birmingham third, Liverpool fourth, well established. There hasn't really been any change in that immigration. It's sound bites at the moment, and we'll see how that plays out. I don't see much change to those people who are living outside the EU in their immigration process. Rather, this is more about sort of Eastern European and Europe having that free movement into the UK. At the moment as well, obviously there's been a huge amount of foreign investment into the UK. I put this presentation together about 10 days ago, and then all of a sudden, now that it seems that the UK will get a deal on Brexit, and it seems that is becoming far more likely, the pound had its greatest rally for 21 months, but obviously still incredibly low. I've lived here in Hong Kong a long time. I can remember when it was 16 Hong Kong dollars to the pound, and I think at the moment we're about 10.4 or maybe a little bit less or more at the moment. But that's obviously stimulated the UK market because it's become 20% cheaper because the pound has gone weak. Just going to briefly run through the property markets. London, obviously in terms of a city, then a true financial global centre, the same as Hong Kong. Very similar to Hong Kong as well. Property prices in London have absolutely skyrocketed, and certainly since 2008, the price of property in London has gone up by 40% more than its previous peak. Again, a lot of foreign investors. What that's done to the population is London is it's forced them out more now. So you find a lot more Londoners are moving into the commuter belt for London. So obviously, we're quite desensitised, I suppose, to property prices here in Hong Kong because they're so high. Expect the same in London. What's happening at the moment is though you are getting a drop off. So there's been an organic cooling in the market. The property prices, certainly in central London, are dropping, and the property prices in the commuter belt are actually rising because the wealth is being forced out of the centre of London. My home city, Manchester, lot of investment, a lot of regeneration in Manchester. BBC moved there. It's become a media hub, financial services hub. That's due to a government initiative called the Northern Powerhouse, which was started by George Osborne a good few years ago, and that was really pushing the economy out of London into the northern cities. Huge investment from mainland China in the Manchester Airport City. You now see Beijing Construction and Engineering doing residential projects. Our own family office over here in Hong Kong, Peterson Group, they brought one of the most iconic buildings in the city centre of Manchester, which is the Great Northern Warehouse. So, significant regeneration and opportunity there. 5 excellent universities, which makes it the largest university campus in Europe. So very, very strong, and as I say, a big Asian community there as well. Birmingham is the second largest city by population in the UK. It's also the youngest city in Europe, so 40% of the population is below 25. Again, they've got 5 excellent universities. You're finding a lot of graduates now are staying in these cities due to the regeneration. And finally, I think I'm overrunning here, so my apologies. Finally, Liverpool. Again, Liverpool is or was one of the richest cities in the world about 100, 150 years ago, and now has started to regenerate significantly. Again, good, great universities, and actually has the largest Chinese student population of any of the UK cities in terms of the university. As a market, £50 billion has just been put into a huge infrastructure project in Liverpool, and that's going to have a huge amount of possibilities in respect of employment. Over 250,000 jobs have been generated there for a population, a city centre population of 500,000, so pretty significant. And that's it from me. So thank you very much. If you do have any questions, as I say, we are based here in Hong Kong. We're in the UN Street East in Central. You're more than welcome to come and have a cup of coffee or tea with us. We're delighted to see you and support you in any way that we can.
Thanks so much, Andy, for those insights. I might just have a question or two, and then we'll ask the audience for their questions too.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, you talked through Brexit. I suppose with all the uncertainties, we still see quite a lot of foreign investments going to the UK. Can you maybe talk us through some of the drivers?
Yeah, I mean, obviously currency has been a big driver. Only last week, the largest sovereign wealth fund, the Norwegian wealth fund, just put trillions into the UK market. And even us as a business, we're finding that as well, that certainly the uncertainty of Brexit has caused a certain amount of reluctance to invest into the UK from normal people like us. But from the institutional level, I think there's an understanding that a deal will be done. I think it has to be done from both sides, to be fair. I don't think the EU wants us to crash out either. So that's been a big thing, certainly currency. When you look at the UK as a market as well, you know, there's so many diverse cities with different focuses. So Manchester became a media hub. You know, great soft branding. Graphene was invented in Manchester, which is going to change the world of electronics. Birmingham obviously became the financial services centre. So there's an opportunity for those investors to build a diverse portfolio to get capital growth and yield. So it just gives them that opportunity. So I think that's what kept the market buoyant for sure.
Okay, we may take some questions from the audience. 大家冇問題問下 Andy。
佢哋有冇做？我想問咧，佢哋有冇做啲 second hand 嘅樓嘅？
Yes, yeah, we can do. Yeah, for sure.
Somebody found interest in some places like bistro or some.
Yeah, I mean, we are independent, so we're very agile within the market. We've been there 14 years, so we know, you know, all of we're actually a marketing media company at heart, so we're still writing huge amounts of research. So we know those markets incredibly well. So we're well placed to find property or dispose of property wherever they are.
Okay, so I can contact you in the office.
For sure.
For more information.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Jacob.
我太過明白咧，點解脱歐咧，咁應該有好大部分，即係好多人都會係離開英國嘅。咁但係點解個英國嘅樓價而家嘅屋價仲係升緊嘅？
I think the actual reality is far better than what has been used as a propaganda, if you like. When you actually look at that Brexit process, you had two very polar opposite sides. One was talking awful things about immigration and things like that, and then on the other side, they were talking about how badly it was going to damage the economy. And in honesty, you know, the two sides are probably somewhere in the middle. Property prices haven't been damaged because the underlying fundamental macroeconomics for property in the UK have remained unchanged, and that is that there's a huge supply and demand issue. So anything where there's not enough of a product but people want to buy it, that is always going to push the prices. So that's the reason why property has not been affected. Certainly prices in some areas like London, you can see the London, you know, the prime centre of London, they've started to drop. But again, it goes down to, you know, the UK's got a number of different cities, so there's an opportunity to understand where each of those cities are in their cycle. Because they have different focuses, they have different industries within those cities. So that's, you know, again, it's understanding the market and picking at the right time to go to different cities.
Okay.